Welcome to Spoiler Piece Theater, the podcast that doesn't give a shit about spoilers. We just want to talk about the movies. My name is Evan Crean. I'm editor for The Independent and co-chair of the Boston Online Film Critics Association. I'm flying solo today for this very special episode. We're going to chat with writer-director Dan Schechter about his film Safe Spaces, which is now called
After Class.
Which is this year's opening night film at the Boston Jewish Film Festival. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess why don't we start there? The film, currently titled Safe Spaces, now going to be titled After Class.
All right.
What's the story with that?
It's pretty lousy, but apparently, so even though most young people don't, a lot of people still order movies on video on demand on cable television. Mm-hmm. And when doing so, the movies appear in alphabetical order. So unbeknownst to me, the deal that was made to sell the movie, they had to change it to something that started with an A.
Okay.
And there's actually, statistical evidence that backs up that they will make more money doing it. So you have to change your title, which is a bummer. It's like changing your kid's name, 3 years into their life when you're very used to seeing it one way. Although Safe Spaces was a title that we were ambivalent about for a while. It's a phrase that's very loaded for people. They get either really pissed off about it one way or the other. And mm-hmm. The movie isn't trying to provoke people in that sense. It's more advocating just for having nuanced positions on these complicated times and subjects. So Justin Long, who's asleep in the next room, he I don't think was the biggest fan of Safe Spaces either. I think we just didn't want to kind of poke the bear with that title. So it wasn't the end of the world, but After Class is fairly benign and doesn't quite tie the movie together the way we felt that Safe Spaces did. But we never quite picked the title we were in love with.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could just kind of briefly tell listeners about the film,
Sure.
Just kind of overall the story of the film.
The movie is quasi-autobiographical comedy. It's not really me, but it's some version of me and people in my life with some inventions, a lot of inventions. Mm-hmm. And it's about a New York City professor who does something that is really borderline inappropriate that the students don't take well and the school doesn't handle well. And in this movie, we see how he processes that and how the people in his life process that. Mm-hmm. And then sort of parallel to that, he ends up spending a lot of time hiding out with his family while they're all in a hospital around their ailing grandmother. And we get a real strong sense of almost a dysfunctional family comedy that the likes of which the Boston Jewish Film Festival, I imagine, was rather drawn to. And hopefully those movies, thematically tie together as the movie progresses.
Yeah, I think they do. They're balanced out really well, both stories kind of coming together. I think equally on its own could be a compelling plot, but together, I think they go together really well. Yeah,
the school stuff, it's not equal in screen time. It's probably about maybe a third to 2/3, but it's the most sort of, dangerous stuff in the movie, exciting stuff in the movie. Even when I was having readings of the screenplay in my apartment when I would have friends over, I felt the room come to life. They're like, oh, that's dangerous. Mm-hmm. Shit, I was a teacher and taught at several schools, some of which this is loosely based on the behavior that I saw that concerned me and fascinated me. And I would come home and tell my family some dumb thing I said or some reaction a student had that I couldn't have imagined. And people didn't believe it. It was almost like I was like a Afghanistan, war reporter coming back trying to explain what the front lines looked like. The generation was something maybe people would experience through Twitter, but not really in real life, where you saw how, especially at that time when Trump was running, Oscar So White, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ exploding, all these, they wanted to mirror the activism they were seeing in social media and on television with, mixed results. And every day was like walking on, not eggshells, walking on landmines. Mm-hmm. So it was a really tough experience to teach there at that time. But I also saw aspects of myself that I didn't love, like being defensive and being naive and not particularly empathetic towards life's, points of views that I didn't have. So hopefully the movie is an equal opportunity examiner.
I think so. I think kind of initially in the beginning of the film, it feels more like it's coming down on the side of the students than on Justin's character, Josh. And his defensiveness almost seems like it's going to be like, oh, okay, well, he's kind of the villain here because he's so defensive and so unwilling to listen to what people are saying. But I think the film does a really good job of walking that line.
Yeah. And the movie approaches that, but it's also weirdly a bit of a Rorschach test. That was your experience with the movie. Mm-hmm. But maybe typically older people or some of them hate the students from the beginning and think that this guy's being treated terribly unfairly because he made one arguable mistake. Well, who knows? Some people thought, what a cool teacher, and that was interesting what he does. Mm-hmm. And I like when people start in a very polarized direction, either disliking him or strongly empathizing with him. Mm-hmm. And hopefully by the end of the movie, maybe you would have changed your mind or found a middle ground at some point in it. We did an interview earlier today where I can tell Justin was talking with this woman and I can tell she didn't like the character, which is fine by me. In fact, I almost prefer it because he's kind of based on me and it makes me relieved that I didn't stack the deck too heavily to make you feel bad for that guy, because I think some of the students are really brave in what they're doing or correct in what they're doing.
Yeah.
Or at least trying to articulate something that, that they just were a little too young to fully articulate well. So it's interesting. Almost everyone I talk to has a different reaction to it, which is great.
Yeah. So obviously the scenes with his family feel very Jewish. There's a very Jewish dynamic to that. Do you feel like there are any other aspects of the story that are Jewish, like the conflict resolution, the idea that you are needing to, address the grievance with the person you've wronged?
That's interesting. I culturally identify as Jewish. I'm not particularly religious. It's interesting. Mm-hmm. We got into the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival, which is one of the best in the country. And then the next day, all of the other ones invite you in, which is wonderful. I'm like, oh, it's like a way I have an in to have more people experience the movie. And even before that, it was always the Jews in the audience who came up to me afterwards, like, oh my God, did you have a tape recorder in our hospital room? And so obviously there's something, my family's half Italian, half Jewish, but it's a New York sensibility. But you're saying that there's something interesting about the end about almost atoning for a sin that he does, or at least trying to validate this other person's feelings with something, which that is a spoiler. That's what happens at the end of this movie in a scene that I think I'm really proud of, and I think lands the movie in a nice place. I certainly wasn't conscious of that, but I am conscious of my guilt, meaning somebody says to me, I hurt their feelings, and I have, as most of us do, this intense cocktail of both anger and defensiveness, and then shame and regret and guilt. And hopefully the older you get, the more experience you have. In my experience, the more therapy you have, you can be a bit more objective and realize when the other person is saying something legitimate to you, and you can grow by hearing them and offering them a legitimate apology without the word but, 3 words later. But that's really, really tough to do. But, my father is the more Jewish side of my family, and he instilled in me just an insane amount of morality and a sense of fairness and justice that was always really important to him. That's really important to me. And sometimes, and injustice can be social injustice, but it could also be that, Larry David, you stole my parking spot and it was mine and injustice. So those things can drive you equally insane. Obviously they're not equally important, but there's an inner sense of me of fairness and just wanting to see things objectively. And to do that, you have to take your ego out of it. And that's what's so hard for the Justin Long character in the movie. He just doesn't want to feel like he's a bad guy. None of us do. And you don't have to just be Harvey Weinstein to use this decade, this movement, this time to take some inventory and go, how could I be better?
Mm-hmm. I love the scene where the other students, the male students, come to him and say like, "Oh, you're like our hero," and like you want to join this Facebook group, and then you just see him feel so grossed out by that idea. And like, you need to get out of here because like these are not the people that I want to identify with. I think it's a really great journey, like seeing him kind of grow that empathy more and more as the film goes on.
Yeah, he at one point he's feeling so bad for himself that 2 students come to him. And for the first time in the movie, somebody says, buddy, you're a great guy. And they're all being assholes, meaning you don't have to grow. And that is such a seductive thought. That's why white supremacy or Trump. These things are so popular because you don't have to work on yourself. Fuck those people. You're fine. You're great just the way you are. Who doesn't want to hear that? And you have to fight against that instinct. So that scene, yes, I think is really funny. And those kids were great in that scene, but also affords me some goodwill. And that I'm clearly criticizing a certain self-righteous white culture that thinks that they seem to desperately want to feel like the victim. And feeling like a victim is wonderful. It's way better than feeling like the asshole.
For sure. I feel like food takes up, it's like you see the characters eating a lot, specifically bagels.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, what's your bagel order? Like,
that is a shamelessly Jewish reference. I remember writing it in the screenplay. You do a thing that's called dual dialogue, where you can see both characters talking at the same time in side-by-side columns. And the dialogue is not funny. One is ordering a cinnamon raisin bagel with cream cheese, and one is ordering, can I get tofu, cream cheese, and like coffee. But there's something so specific about that to that culture in New York City that I just knew it would be insanely funny to see those two people side by side just overlapping each other and just ordering loudly in a place. I like to do the thing that I think some politician was like really... Maybe it was Elizabeth Warren. It was somebody who likes the sweet and the savory at the same time. So like a cinnamon raisin bagel with like a tuna fish, like something that some people could be repulsed by. I guess my dad made that a lot. So I like to do things like that. And then I do feel a little self-conscious when it's a packed place and I have to order it loudly, because either you get it and you dig it and it's like, this is our Jewish McGriddle, or you're like, oh, that is just a repulsive sounding combination of food.
Yeah, I'd say the raisins kind of conjure to mind kugel to me, and like certain kinds of kugel, sometimes raisins, I'm not about it.
I love
potato.
That.
I like cheese. I'm not so much with the Luxem kugel.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, I wasn't raised in a house where we were just given food like that, but I think Jews just do have an insane sweet tooth. Like almost, even if you have, almost like a New York Jewish deli. A stuffed cabbage versus like an authentic Ukrainian stuffed cabbage. Theirs is just like some thick mushroom sauce, and ours is it's almost like the red sauce on top of like sweet and sour chicken at a Chinese food restaurant. I mean, it's fucking crazy. But I definitely eat too much sugar. I think that's probably Jewish. I blame them.
Can you talk a little bit about the casting? Just because I think everyone in this film is really great. They have really great chemistry.
Thank you.
And the grandmother in particular, she's amazing. I've seen her in other roles, and I just think like every time she's just so awesome.
Yeah, she. Thank you for saying that. And I think what's kind of cool about the family in the movie is that they look plausibly like a family, which is hard to do in a movie because sometimes you just have to accept that Rashida Jones and Adam Scott are brother and sister because that's who they cast. And this movie, you really can buy it, which to me is always really important. It's something I always aim for. And sometimes I think we got lucky with some actors who said no. It was like a cool bit of luck. Lynn Cohen is the one who plays the grandma. And this movie was made initially because my grandma died and I loved her so much and she was such a fun personality. And every casting director that I talked to, or every person in New York I talked to said, you got to cast Lynn Cohen, which immediately made me not want to cast Lynn Cohen because you don't want to typecast people. Like in this movie, Fran Drescher's in it, but she's not really doing what you've seen her do before. She's doing something a little bit more grounded and vulnerable and new. And that's what I like to see when I see movies. But then I met with Lynn and she just had the quality my grandma had. It was really cool. She was just, in movies, there's sort of like rapping naughty grandmas, and then there's sort of like very pearl clutchy, how dare you, grandma? But most grandmas are just fucking cool. They're just women who've like done a bunch of sex and life and things, and they're not that uptight. And like I can just talk to my grandma like a person, and so she was like that too. She was a small woman, huge personality, and going to spoilers, there's a death in the movie. And I've never made a movie where people cried in it, but you hear in the audience, there's a kind of a deathbed scene that is really vulnerable. And I think she's wonderful in scene and it helps, but I think it's also a character that most people tend to project that person that they love so much. I can't tell you how many people come up to me and go, that was like my mother who died last month, or my father, or my uncle, or my grandparent, or whatever. And I think the movie allows you this kind of opportunity to remember that person, and she plays that so well. She just plays an unconditionally loving, charming person. And then every person has a great story. My mother texted me one day and just said Fran Drescher. I didn't know what the context of her text was. And I later realized that she was suggesting her to play her, which was a cool idea. Again, it was Fran against type. My mother, same age, grew up in Queens, same kind of attitude, not the voice and laugh, but some of that kind of swagger. So that was cool. Justin, speaking of podcasts, a buddy of mine is Doug Benson, who has a great podcast called Doug Loves Movies. I listen to it all the time. And Doug took a shine to me at a film festival and liked my movie, and we became friendly. And I, knew that Justin had done his podcast a couple times. And I said, oh, I hate to ask this, but like, would you ever consider passing along to him? And Doug was, he didn't, I'm sure he did look at it as a favor, but he looked at it like, I'm putting two people together that I think would be happy that this marriage was happening. And Justin was great. I was reminding him today of he's trying to make a movie now, and he's making offers, and I'm like, doesn't it suck being on the other side when you're praying and waiting by the phone, either that they read it at all or that they say yes, and you're powerless, because directors like control. And Justin, after Doug texted him, Justin texted me 10 minutes later. I emailed him the script 10 minutes later, and then he just kept texting me updates of what he liked and didn't like, and he's like, okay, I gotta go to dinner, but this never happens. Like, you are in a void, or this person is defended by 3 layers of representation. And it was very generous what Justin did. And in a weird way, I think it's actually a much fucking braver role than it appears. You know what I mean? Like, he is putting himself out there to be the poster boy of like an unaware white guy who feels a little entitled and privileged and all that. And he's not playing to that or against it, but he just is it. I am it. And yet you care about him and see that there's, obvious goodness or willingness to learn, underneath it. So I'm very enamored with his performance and casting. And of course, I'm using his insane likability to help you carry you through the movie, where he is quite unlikable at times.
Yeah. It is a fine line for his character to walk. For sure. Yeah.
But it wasn't something like, oh man, we really had to measure this carefully. And I'm writing a version of myself with my perspective on the world, or certainly maybe if I was more like 2-3 years ago, that I have and you have some faith that you're a good person and other people see your goodness. And there will be bad faith people who are going to kind of go, well, he said this, so therefore I can't control that. And I was terrified for this movie to come out and have a Q&A where somebody raises their hand angrily in the back and they go off on how I represented a certain culture or joke or something I just was in my blind spot, or something totally unfair that I didn't agree with at all. And we haven't had any of that. I think the behavior of the students in the movie is so crappy in and of itself that they're almost shamed to be that performatively critical of the movie, I guess, or something like that. And the movie, like I said, it just kind of advocates for not being extreme about your opinion and just sort of like being a little nuanced and kind of having some fucking humility. When something is as complicated as the scenario that comes up in this movie is.
Would you say that's basically what you're hoping people take away from the film?
Yeah. I remember there was a scene in one of my classes where the kids all were really yelling at each other, and it was a multicultural, very diverse class. And there was accusations of misogyny and racism and all this kind of stuff. And I remember thinking, this would be funny if the camera was on my face, because how the fuck am I going to handle this? What training do I have? What do I say to these people? I'm just the whitest of white guys. And I remember when things finally did calm down, I kind of said, like, not only is there a burden on some people in this class to listen when people are trying to tell them what their experience is, there is unfortunately also a burden on the person giving that message. And trying to make it a legitimately teachable moment with some empathy and understanding. Because if you're going to throw a rock at somebody, they're just not going to want to hear you. The movie has a scene early on where people are just going at each other and no one's listening. And then at the end, this final exchange between Josh and the student who we've been hearing about the whole movie, we haven't heard her speak. She says, I know you're not a bad person. I think you were unaware of why I felt this way. Here's why I felt that way. Whether that's legitimate to you or not, it's really how I felt in your classroom. And he takes it and he gives her, I think, an authentic apology, because he really listens for the first time. And that seems to be pretty relevant in Twitter culture, to try to communicate in that way.
Yeah, it does. It feels very genuine when you watch it. Like, you look at him and you can say, like, earlier in the movie, he was talking about, I don't want to apologize. I don't want to give an inauthentic apology. I don't want to apologize for the sake of it. It does register as genuine that he is legitimately sorry for this. And
Yeah, I do hope nobody listens to this before they watch the movie. Hopefully, the spoiler title of your movie will be enough, because I find a lot of people have come up to me, maybe too many have come to me and said, they were like, "Bro, I didn't know how to feel about this movie." It's usually a person of color, maybe somebody who's LGBTQ or somebody who has been a victim of sexual assault.
Yeah.
They're like, "I really did not know if you knew the fire you were playing with until that scene." And that actress is so good in that moment. And it wasn't like a monologue where in the script everyone was like, "Dan, beautiful monologue." No one ever complimented it. And then she does it, and does it so reasonably and so vulnerably and so without self-pity that you believe it changes him in that moment in a way that maybe he was ready to give a fake apology, and she turns it into a real apology with this one last effort to make him understand. And yeah, that felt great. We were pleased with that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
When you were making the movie, were there other films or filmmakers that you were thinking like as kind of a reference point for the kind of movie that you want to make, or the aesthetic? Or I feel like the music choice was specific in this movie, and I didn't know if you were there's somebody in mind that you're like, this person was an inspiration.
It's funny. I get that question obviously every time I make a movie. And with this movie, I don't remember we had many references or we watched much with my DP, maybe one or two things for visuals or something like that. But I think it was because it was like my life, and like the objective wasn't to go, "Oh, I wanted to feel this tone." It was like, I want to get it right. I want to show what it was like in a hospital room. I want to show what it was like sometimes with my dad's life, or a version of that, or I want to show what it was like to, be in that classroom. And it was just about trying to match it up with my memory. Because, like, I'm not saying this movie is like The Lighthouse or anything, but I also can't tell you another movie that's like this movie. Like, there's not really one that I can point to, which is hard sometimes when you're promoting your movie. You want to have, it's like
this meets that,
right? And there's really not much of that in this movie, and I think that's some of the benefit of, like, in between movies, getting some life experience outside of being a filmmaker. That I was like, oh, this is an interesting world, and also recognizing, like I said earlier, that other people aren't seeing this. This feels a little new. I mean, I think there's definitely a cliche now of like young kids who are a bit too like woke cancel culture or something like that, but not really the way I saw it. And it's a danger. Right behind you, there's a muted version of CNN, and I see Joe Biden. And if this guy gets nominated, and I'm not a big fan, I'm not rooting for him, but there will definitely be those kids trying to take him down, despite the fact that Donald Trump will be president again. And I can't imagine anything more dangerous than that. So it's not a movie where I'm trying to communicate to conservatives. I'll never convince them of anything. I've given up on that. But liberals, maybe there's just some hope that we're all in this together, and we need to compromise a little bit.
Yeah, best case scenario is that it starts a conversation with people, and people talk about it, and hopefully come to some type of middle ground.
That would be lovely. Yeah. Thanks, though. Thanks for all the questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.